In a time of economic prosperity but of frank moral decay within Venezuelan politics on the eve of the next presidential elections, the candidacy of Reni Ottolina, a man recognized in all corners of the country for his extensive career as a broadcaster and presenter. Starting from an original reading about the damage that partisanship was causing to the nation, he captivated thousands of independent Venezuelans by transmitting a message of change. Censorship, threats, and the kidnapping of his daughters were some of the difficulties he had to face on his journey. And when his popularity began to become uncomfortable for the parties, months before the contest for the presidency, he unexpectedly died in a plane crash. Reni Ottolina was not just any politician, nor was he a traditional one. Not in vain, posterity remembers him as the #1 in Venezuelan television, whose disruptive words continue to inspire new generations of Venezuelans. Today, in this new installment, we will present his extraordinary life as a multifaceted professional and his brief but very significant political career in the 70s. My name is Alejandro Andrade. This is the new encyclopedia and we invite you to watch the video until the end so you don't miss any part of this special installment. Reynaldo Jose Ottolina Pinto was born on December 11, 1928 in Valencia. Unfortunately, due to the difficult childbirth process, Renny's mother passed away shortly after and her place was taken by his paternal grandmother and his uncle, Carlos. A man remembered for his strong character who would go on to play a fundamental role in shaping the persevering and disciplined personality of the future #1. And so, between the severity of his uncle and the affections of his grandmother, his most tender childhood passed. In the first home he knew. At the age of 6, he traveled with his grandmother to a beautiful house that his father had rented in Caracas. And Renny was enrolled in school. Lazail was a smart, joking, and mischievous child with a huge desire to stand out among others. But as little Renny became more restless, he was sent to board at the Sacred Heart of Jesus School, an institution that then enjoyed the reputation of being very uncompromising in the education of boys. In his adolescence, he was boarded at the San Jose de los Teques school, where he continued to disobey the rules with his ingenious occurrences. The punishments he received were so frequent that he came up with the idea of escaping from the boarding school with his best friend, a plan he successfully carried out until he was caught by the Caracas police going to buy cigarettes. These kinds of rebellious acts were what characterized his unruly adolescence, and for the rest of his life, he showed that he continued to be a rebel in the face of routine in each of his professional facets. During the long punishments he received at San Jose College because of his rebellion, Renny used the time to learn English, which helped him get his first job. At 16 years old, translating the newswires received in English into Spanish. As he needed to increase his income, he went on to work for the United States diplomatic delegation transcribing telegrams. At 17 years old, he began his extraordinary journey through radio at Radio Caracas without a title and without enough money to be able to pay for the exam at the Ministry of Communications to accredit himself as a broadcaster. While he worked for Radio Caracas in 1945, he managed to take that exam. But due to the coup d'etat of October 18th, the authorities did not give him his verification until the beginning of the following year. When he finally had it in his hands, he managed to debut as a broadcaster, producing and narrating the program The American Review. But radio was not the only passion that the young Renny discovered. Cinema would also constitute an important part of his career. When the president of Bolivar Films hired him in his company, he included him as a presenter of the cast of the movie Venezuela. He also sings. He worked at the company for 10 years, and during his time at the studios, he acquired invaluable experience in documentary production and in film technique. While he continued working at Radio Caracas radio stations, he moved to Radio Difusora Venezuela, where he didn't last long because his boss didn't like his avant-garde style. When he was fired, his old boss suggested he better dedicate himself to something else, ignoring the bad advice of his former boss. He quickly sought work at Radio Cultura, where he was hired for his already established reputation in the field. Renny's new boss entrusted him with one of the star programs called Special Orange Cruise Nights. In his new space, he had the opportunity to present international artists in Venezuela and thus begin his career in the world of entertainment. In the 50s, during the dizzying progress that Venezuela was experiencing, the great boom of national television exploded. And Renny, of course, found in technological innovations more opportunities to increase his fame. In 53, he appeared on the program, What is Your Profession?, broadcasted on Televisa. 2 years later, in 55, he was hired at RCTV and directed several programs that had very good ratings. And after a fruitful work trip to New York, he returns to Venezuela with new knowledge that inspired him to premiere Lo de Hoy, the program that would catapult him to stardom. Renny would continue to progress in his successful professional career, inaugurating in 58 his famous variety show, The Reni Show. Perhaps the most remembered program of his entire career for having presented with his extraordinary charisma the most popular international artists of the time. Renny managed to reach the #1 spot in the entertainment world thanks to his two great virtues as a hard-working Venezuelan, discipline and professionalism. In addition to the experience he gained from regular trips to the United States and Europe, but far from focusing solely on the communication business, his thirst for knowledge and physical energy also led him to excel in various activities. From a young age, he cultivated his love for sports, maintaining an athletic lifestyle as an adult, being a professional car racer and training in the gym. In the field of music, his skills in dancing, singing, and composing helped him to boost the jingle in Venezuelan advertising. In each of the products he promoted, he carefully approved its musicalization and, in the same way, relying on his refined musical ear, in each program he premiered, there could not be a lack of cheerful doses of music. After another successful stint in New York, where he became the first Hispanic host to have his own program in English, he returned to Venezuela to restart the Renny Show in the year 62. After several months of broadcasting in the country, he decided to embark on a journey again, eager to learn more and expand his horizons. Spain was his new destination. He set up his residence in Madrid, and there he produced one of the biggest shows of his career for the benefit of the Anti-Cancer Society. What would constitute the first Venezuelan production for the television audience of another country? His remaining time in Spain was spent on various pursuits, mainly traveling through the countryside, accompanied by his friend Gustavo Rodriguez Amengual, to whom on this trip he would express for the first time his desire to be president of Venezuela. Although his world for now was that of show business, he was very far away, as some accuse him, of being a superficial or frivolous man. This is demonstrated by his deep concern for the situation in Venezuela, which led him to voice political opinions live, which gradually caused him problems with political parties. Far from being satisfied with fame, which is transitory, as his impact on Venezuelan households was growing, so was his political consciousness. Deep down, that elegantly dressed man who offered entertainment through his original programming, there was a Renny willing to give up all his comforts to take on the enormous responsibility of influencing the country's direction. It is very important to note that Renny's extensive knowledge was not limited to the communication business. He was a self-taught, multifaceted man and very eager to learn. Apart from Spanish, a language he always demonstrated mastery of in front of the cameras, he spoke English, French, and Italian. He knew the classics of world literature thoroughly, along with painting and music in their various expressions. He had a tremendous intellectual fondness for classical philosophy, especially for Cicero, and among his constant readings, essays and poems were never missing. However, his political vocation would take several more years to mature until it materialized in his candidacy. Meanwhile, in the 60s, Renny continued to reap professional successes. Renny presents his new program premiered in 1964 through RCTV. He received 6 awards from the El Huayca and Puro de Oro prizes in his first year. His excellent professional career as a presenter and publicist. It was no longer just a common climb to fame, but a genuine phenomenon in the region. The undisputed #1 was more than just a showman. Thanks to the quality of his work, which he built, his national and international prestige, and the broadcasting of these in all the homes of the country, Renny had become a very powerful opinion leader in Venezuela. His opinions were listened to attentively. His career was full of successes which projected an image of confidence to the population, and his criticisms of social and political issues influenced Venezuelans without party ties.
No, not at all. I am neither in favor nor against bipartisanship. I am in favor of there being as many political parties as Venezuelans want to form, because that's what the Constitution enshrines. Politicians are essential for a democratic life. You eliminate political parties. Then I am a defender of the institutionalism of the parties.
The problem is not that I am against parties as an institution.
The problem is that I am just another Venezuelan who is fed up with the way COPE and Acción Democrática have been managing the nation.
It's simply time to cleanse the political parties. Those who are endangering democracy are the main parties, who have mismanaged our money and failed at leading our country.
A criticism from Renny that caused deep shock in society was his judgment towards Venezuelan television. Renny watched with concern as television became a tool for the cultural impoverishment of the country. Instead of using this technological medium for the creation of civic virtues and the spread of love for Venezuela, Renny saw the task as responsible and necessary. The high management of the channels prioritized the production of trash content, which tarnished the dignity of man and decorum. On this issue, in the year 67, he expressed the following verbatim: Venezuelan television today does not contribute what it should to national culture. In fact, its influence is perhaps negative. To have a starting point, I am forced to start at the end, which in the case of a trial is the verdict. I find Venezuelan television guilty of ignoring the dignity of the inhabitants of our country. At the same time, I find it guilty of neglect in its programming and of being light on the responsibility that its immense power implies. Equally responsible for this situation are the sponsors, advertising agencies, and television stations. Despite the controversy generated by his words, the public received them well, although, of course, the channel owners did not like them at all. If there was a need for further proof to refute the alleged frivolity of Renny, the content of this article invalidates the accusations of his detractors. A man bewitched by fame wouldn't even have thought about jeopardizing his relationship with the media, on which he depended to voice an opinion, with the hope of alerting the country to the lack of values. A ruthless man. Nor would it have included a series like Getting to Know Venezuela Better to Love It More in its programming, with the purpose of encouraging patriotism in its audience through the dissemination of the country's historical and geographical content. And as we will see later, his moralizing zeal brought him many problems in the industry.
A momentous date when the Army Day is rightly celebrated.
Heirs of dignity, of those who gave so much to the homeland in this field. Men who are remembered today by the double row of 8 proud pedestals on each side.
And whose names should always be pronounced Pay's hero.
Cedeño Hero.
Plaza Hero.
Urdaneta Hero Bermudez.
A great battle in which we also have our soldiers.
Yes, Galabobo, and our children, yesterday and future of the homeland.
However, despite his great success, the road was not smooth for him. Experiencing ups and downs in his life like everyone else, and on more than one occasion he suffered very serious misfortunes that affected the deepest part of his being. In the year 69, he perhaps lived the most traumatic experience of his career as a public man. A normal Thursday. When his daughters were heading to school, several criminals kidnapped them, demanding high sums of money in exchange for their lives. Renny immediately addressed the kidnappers through the television, letting them know that he was willing to do everything in his power to rescue his daughters. The criminals called him and demanded that he go to a certain place with 500,000 bolivars. With the help of friends, he raised the money. He arrived at the designated place, and when he handed over the briefcase, the criminals took his car and left him stranded. Fortunately, the kidnappers safely returned his daughters, and the episode was nothing more than a big scare. When these events unfolded, Venezuela was experiencing a wave of violence, a result of the armed confrontation of guerrillas financed from Cuba against the Venezuelan state. Renny was a valuable target for the subversives, not only for being a recognized businessman, but also for his constant criticisms towards the left-wing movements, which had generated strong rejection in the leadership of this radical sector. For this reason, it was believed that the kidnapping of his daughters had a political motivation. After this tragic episode, Renny told the media that the kidnapping of his daughters was the most terrible thing that has happened to him in his 43 years of existence. An opinion he would hold until the end of his life. Despite the problems in his private life, the following years of his life were marked by grandiose television successes. After his return to the country from another trip through Europe, in '72, he began his new stage in television on Channel 8, which unknowingly would be the last of all. In those years, he made famous productions, among which is his most remembered program and the best of his career. According to some, Renny presents in Chorun, Meru. For his recording, Renny traveled 150 kilometers of Venezuelan tropical jungle, always leading his team and without showing a hint of fatigue. To fully capture the beauty of the landscape, he didn't need a script. The magical splendor of the journey was his only source of inspiration for the production of the nearly 1 hour-long documentary. In all his programs dedicated to the history and geography of Venezuela, the emotion with which Renny recorded and narrated the most outstanding aspects of the country awakened in his numerous audience the healthy patriotism that every society needs to live in harmony with the space it inhabits and with its compatriots. While encouraging noble feelings of belonging through his programming, he devoted another part of his time to learning, national awareness campaigns. As irrefutable proof of his undeniable commitment to the upliftment of the Venezuelan, he published advertising spots against various problems that plagued the nation, such as accidents due to alcohol consumption and the disobedience of traffic rules.
The reality is often unpleasant precisely because it is reality.
We are in the morgue, and those refrigerated bags contain bodies of people who died on the street.
Many causes: heart attacks, murders, suicides, traffic accidents.
Dr. Ramon Velasco heads the Metropolitan Zone's Forensic Medicine Department.
Doctor, what is the percentage of deaths that enter here due to traffic accidents?
50%, meaning that 5 out of every 10 deaths that enter there are due to traffic accidents. And those deaths are due to 2 main causes, alcohol and speeding.
Thanks for the information, Aldo.
If you drive when you drink or speed because you're so macho and you know it all,
You should know that your draw is here waiting for you. And what's worse, no one will thank you, especially not your family.
In the eyes of many, Renny represented an example of action and a hope for change. But for the channel owners, he was starting to become a hindrance to their profits. The Venezuelan television chamber, in collusion with the channel owners, decided to eliminate the concept of independent producer, thus leaving Renny out of television, as he was not willing to sell his freedom in exchange for continuing on the small screen as an employee of a station. The last time Venezuelans were able to tune into a live episode of Renny's show was on December 31st, 1973. After uninterrupted decades of presence in all homes, his farewell program put a golden seal on his journey through television channels. And he left to posterity multiple fragments that still echo today even more strongly than before within the consciousness of Venezuelans.
This and the letters will make you understand when I say that I am full of my country.
And every time I went out with a camera inside the Republic and had through a lens to specify a frame and specify a tree and a branch of a tree and a mountain.
there in the background, it stayed with me.
And to the extent that I gave my country my interest, my country entered me with its greatness. It was inevitable.
Very well.
Very happy of.
True.
His departure left an unfathomable void in his audience, but this obstacle imposed by the channels did not prevent him from continuing to work from other spaces. For Venezuela, in the 70s, now more aware than ever of his commitment to Venezuela, politics was a topic he could not escape from. Due to the oil boom that the government of Carlos Andres Perez was fortunate to experience, a significant sector of society lived in opulence, while another was the object of ostentatious social policies. But along with these policies came other problems that the political caste was uninterested in solving. Renny had further increased his social sensitivity, and even though he no longer had his own television program, he embarked on new special productions, with the purpose of fighting against these ignored problems. His famous institutional campaigns, such as It's a Matter of Integrity and The Good Citizen, were very well received by society, which won the award for the best institutional campaign. In 1975, 2 years later, in July of 1977, Renny would return to the radio. The content of his new program, Renny on His Radio, mainly covered political issues. From Monday to Friday, with an approximate audience of almost 500,000 people, he dedicated himself to criticizing the excesses of the Democratic Action Administration, to comment on the most relevant daily news, to make important complaints to the authorities, to promote good customs, to listen to the opinions of his audience, and to explain his philosophy. After a short time, his program became the most tuned in at a national level, snatching the spot from other programs that for months were the undisputed owners of the top spots. As his prodigious career shows, with or without channels, Renny would reap achievements. His popularity was of such magnitude that he could easily do without the big businessmen who conspired against him. The Venezuelans loved him and trusted him. In the realm of political relations, the moral merit that society recognized in him for his virtues was a characteristic that he needed to take advantage of to drive the change he advocated. He undoubtedly possessed the good reputation without which nothing can be achieved in the realm of politics. And this, coupled with the strong tone of his criticisms of the party system, the reach of his words and the increasingly strong rumors of his possible candidacy began to unsettle the government of Carlos Andres Perez. The director of the radio station where Renny broadcast his program was summoned to the office of the Ministry of Interior Relations. Present at the meeting were ministers Octavio Lepage, Diego Barria, and Jesus Vivas Casanova. The government politicians ordered the director to inform Renny that he needed to tone down his comments and that he better dedicate himself to entertaining the people. Renny's response to the government's attempts to curtail his freedom of expression was frank. He had no intention of modifying the content of his program to curry favor with the government. He was not committing any crime, nor was he telling any lies to the country. As he continued to criticize the authorities, this time the Supreme Electoral Council. In December of 1977, his program was indefinitely banned. What many thought unthinkable happened. Democratic Action had just censored the popular program of the number one. The censorship of his program, far from favoring democratic action in any way, showed many the fear it instilled among the parties. The political influence that Renny had achieved in recent months could not return to the entertainment industry as the government believed was more convenient for its interests. He was already within the political field. The time when he was dedicated to bringing out smiles was left behind. The time had come to offer the country an alternative to the traditional parties.
Other political party candidates to be presidents. For me, the job of president is not the goal of my life. It's simply a means, a way to be able to serve my patriarch.
That's all. I love you very much. And on behalf of everyone, thank you very much.
In July of 1977, he founded his party National Integrity Movement. The official announcement of his candidacy was met with many positive comments. He chose "for a decent government" as his slogan and decided to use his well-known glasses as a campaign symbol. Relying on his large audience and with a cultured and persuasive language, he gradually built his political base. He structured his party into three areas. The first was the planning area, the other was strategy, and the third was intended for general coordination directed by the presidency. The first thing to define was the pre-candidate's activity schedule, the campaign financing, and the collection of signatures to present the candidacy. In his launch, the efforts of the National Integrity Movement bore fruit. In record time, the newly born political organization had constituted 140 support committees in 19 entities, including the Federal District. However, despite its popularity, its detractors maintained that the hypothetical presidential election of Reni or Ottolina was an impossibility as it did not come from traditional parties. But the polls of the time revealed the truth about their chances of winning. The first poll, where Renny is mentioned, positions him in July of 77 with a 13% approval, barely surpassed by a margin of 3% by Luis Piñarua, the candidate of Democratic Action, and Luis Herrera Campins, the candidate of Copaica, who in the end was elected. Later on, in December of 77, the National Public, a survey conducted by Ecodata revealed that Rene Ottolina was in second place among the most admired and respected people among political leaders. A position that tied with Romulo Betancourt, founder of Democratic Action, and Herrera Campins.
And you, who would you vote for? From Celis to Siena? Rene Ottolina, would you vote for? Well,
yes, if it comes to that, yes, thinking about it, I would vote for Rene Ottolina. Would you vote for him?
Why not you?
Almost. Sure, maybe yes.
What is your opinion on Reni Ottolina's candidacy? Do you support Reni Ottolina?
Well, that he could be the salvation of Venezuela.
The studies of the time and the existence of a broad Venezuelan middle class where he was very beloved. They attest that Renny, even though he was building a political party from scratch and had to fight against the censorship of his platform, had real chances of winning, or failing that, to consolidate himself as a major political force in the eventual elections. Another common criticism against him is that Renny, in reality, as he was a man dedicated to the show for years, lacked knowledge and a philosophy to support his party. Anyone who has listened to his programs will know that there is nothing further from the truth than this slander. In addition to numerous readings and self-education, the greatest intellectual influence on Renny's ideology was Simon Bolivar. In public, he claimed it to regain the pride of being Venezuelan. And in his free time, he liked to devote himself in his office to studying the writings of the Liberator, like the Angostura speech and his enriching correspondence. From his reflections, he wrote a manuscript titled Bolivar Already Said It, where he analyzed the essential principles of his political postulates. Unfortunately, both this and another manuscript in which he expressed the Venezuelan reality and his project for a new country, they never came to light due to his sudden death. However, thanks to his programs and the interviews he gave, we can know in detail several of his most important proposals. In the field of economics, he condemned state capitalism, which he considered responsible for the total overwhelming of private enterprise. In contrast to hyperstatism and chronic dependence on oil, he proposed a social function capitalism oriented towards the idea of turning Venezuela into an agricultural power. He advocated for free initiative to transform the omnipotence of the state, but made it very clear that private enterprise, on its part, it had to abandon the indifference towards the country and assume responsibilities that it refused to accept. In the field of politics, he defended the current national constitution, but for its proper compliance, he considered it essential to end partisanship, an evil that was corroding the state and whose damages were already noticeable in the increase of corruption and the patronage. Instead, he offered to continue with the democratic system, but ending the oligarchy of bipartisanship and giving space to renewed organizations and new political leaders. In the ideological field, the Marxists hated him, as they considered him a docile instrument for American interests, and it differed from the materialistic reading of the country's situation, and he corresponded to that version with a deep repudiation towards communism and with strong criticisms towards student movements that vandalized public spaces.
I consider that the Chinese, as long as they're under the system they are in, are my natural enemies, as Venezuelans.
In that sense, I could agree. I am definitely anti-communist. I do not believe in masses.
Finally, above any economic problem, he was even more concerned about the crisis of values. Following the thought of Libertador, he understood that Venezuelans lacked a motivation superior to material progress to truly grow and not be satisfied with the temporary salaries of petrodollars. Bolivar exclaimed that morality and enlightenment were the country's primary needs at the time of its independence. And in the 70s, Rene understood that these were still the primary needs that needed to be addressed. There was a need to promote public morality, to unite the population in the pursuit of a common destiny, and to sow from education the fruitful seed of spiritual values, without which one cannot aspire to be the great nation that, by its history, the country should be. Rescuing Venezuela from its inevitable decline through the restoration of patriotic virtues was his greatest proposal. But an unexpected catastrophe deprived Venezuelans of the possibility of seeing him carry out his political plans. March 16, 1978, The day Reni Ottolina disappeared started as a normal day. After completing his usual training session at the gym, he went to his company's headquarters where he met with his trusted men to coordinate the trip he would make in the afternoon to Margarita Island. There, the president of the Association of Executives of the State of Nueva Esparta would be waiting for him, under whose auspices he would give the lecture, Venezuela Today and Its Future. Unaware that they were making a momentous decision between flying on a commercial airline or accepting the offer from pilot Carlos Oropesa to travel in his small plane, they chose the second plan. He fulfilled the rest of his personal and political obligations, and after a few hours he was with his companions at the Miquetia Airport hangar where they would take off. He was accompanied by pilot Carlos Olavarria, television director Luis Duque, and 2 members of the operational team of his party. The radiant sun and clear sky offered beautiful weather for traveling. The aircraft had recently been acquired, but its pilot already had numerous flight hours. Nothing foreshadowed the tragic end that awaited the 5 crew members. At 5:13 p.m., they took off towards the sea. The routine communications with the control tower proceeded normally until suddenly the plane disappeared from the radar 6 minutes after the flight had begun. Given that they had lost track of them, at 6:55 the airport declared the aircraft in emergency. At that moment, the arduous rescue mission of the technical team began, made up of officials from the Ministry of Transport and Communications, the Venezuelan Air Forces, and the National Guard. It was mistakenly believed at first that it had crashed into the sea, and all the aircraft and ships of the operation were looking for them on the unfathomable sea surface. What no one suspected is that the remains were closer than they thought. These were sleepless days for many Venezuelans. On Monday, March 20th, 3 days later, when few still had hopes of finding them alive or dead, the remains of the ship were spotted. At 3 in the afternoon, a plane from the operation that was coming back reported having seen some flashes on the hill. He communicated his suspicions to a National Guard helicopter, which proceeded to search the indicated site. A member of the MIM's political command was the first to confirm that it was the plane that an entire worried country was asking, where was it? In the midst of thick vegetation and 20 kilometers from Miquetia Airport lay the charred remains of the man who could have changed the fate of Venezuela. News of the recovery of his remains was scarcely disseminated. Venezuelan society, but especially the numerous supporters of Reni, suspected that the accident was a plan orchestrated by the government of Carlos Andres Perez to stop his candidacy. The president's statements regretting the events did not manage to alleviate suspicions towards him. For its part, the National Integrity Movement published a statement demanding that the authorities unravel the truth, hinting that there was a possibility that some external factor may have caused the disaster. And it didn't take long for dozens of graffiti to appear on the streets with the question, "Who killed Renny?" A mystery that many continue to ponder in our times. From that time to the present, various hypotheses have been formed about his death, with the prevailing idea in the collective imagination being that it was an assassination. There are numerous indications that could be argued in favor or against these hypotheses, which we will present very shortly. But the truth is that the death of a popular politician of proven honesty who threatens the hegemony of a system inevitably arouses suspicions and accusations. And considering that on more than one occasion, power conspired against him, either to expel him from television or to silence his critical voice, it's not surprising that so many people, with or without evidence, blame the political system for his death. But did the government commit arbitrary actions in its investigations? What are the discrepancies between the official version and the facts? And will the accusations against the Gato group make sense? In the next video about Renny Ottolina, these and other questions will be answered in a thorough investigation where we will delve into the most unknown details about his death. We invite you to subscribe so you don't miss our next special delivery. In his fleeting political life, the eloquent voice, Renny managed to gather independent Venezuelans in his project who were displeased with the direction they were being led, the Republic. In opposition to the economic and moral prejudices of the party system, he raised a real alternative in a record time that captured what a significant sector of the country thought. Renny offered them an ingenious diagnosis, precise answers to their questions, and a clear path to follow. This contrasted with the demagoguery that the electorate was already getting used to. The Venezuela that could have been with Renny in the presidency, we will never know. Death came to him at the most inopportune moment of his life and deprived Venezuelans of the possibility of seeing him distill his multifaceted talent in power. It is uncertain how different the country's fate would have been and what effects it would have had on the bowels of the political establishment if he had been successful in the 78 elections. But his historical memory does not need the sweetening of these dreams to stay alive. Just listen to the astonishing relevance of his words to certify that Renny Ottolina is still present.
I am convinced that the country's return to itself can only be through its consciousness as a country.
I resent that a foreign leader tells me as a Venezuelan what the path is. I remember perfectly well that our country was born saying around here,
I don't want anyone to come and tell us at this point where it is.
I believe firmly and blindly that Venezuela was born to be a leader and to say what the path is, not to follow others.
And I also recognize that due to circumstantial issues, Venezuela has forgotten a bit about itself.
The problem is not material, the problem is mental and emotional.
After nearly 20 years of democracy and governments of Acción Democrática and Social Christian Party, the versatile Renny Ottolina finally made the decision to build a political project for Venezuela. At the beginning of 78, Renny's presidential pre-campaign was progressing successfully. His newly founded Bautista political party, named Movimiento de Integridad Nacional, already surpassed 140 support committees around the country. The polls placed him in a favorable position alongside the main political parties, competing for the top spots with Acción Democrática and Social Christian Party. Despite not having an extensive career in national politics, nor a consolidated party machinery, his foray into politics, where he had to overcome several obstacles, was becoming the most significant production of his entire extensive public career. And with months to go before the elections, circumstances boded well for his party. However, there was still a lot of work to be done. There were 2 weeks left to announce the official launch of his candidacy, for which he was already rehearsing a speech he would deliver to the country. Through his radio program and his tours of various cities, he was adding supporters to his cause, transmitting a message of political and moral reform, of change in the management of the economy, and of recovery of patriotic values. In this context, he receives the sponsorship of the board of the Association of Executives of the state of Nueva Esparta to give a lecture called Venezuela Today and Its Future. At the Concord Hotel in Porlamar on March 16th, at the headquarters of his production company, Renny Ottolina met with his trusted colleagues. At the meeting, they talked about the presidential campaign and coordinated the trip to Porlamar. One dilemma was whether to fly on a commercial airline or accept the favor that the engineer and pilot Carlos Olavarria had offered them in the morning to travel in his private plane. In the end, they decided to choose the second option, and after fulfilling their busy schedule for the day, their colleagues picked them up to go to the Maiquetía airport. When they arrived at the airport, they headed to the hangar where the plane was parked. On the way, several people came up to greet him, and at that moment the last photograph of Reni Ottolina alive was taken. The pilot of the flight would be the aforementioned Carlos Olavarria, and traveling with Reni were Luis Duque, Cesar Oropesa, and Ciro Medina. The plane was a Cessna 310 model recently acquired by Olavarria with financing from Final B, a financial society of the provincial bank, which we will mention again later. The aircraft was painted white and had blue and red stripes. Its climb rate was 500 feet per minute with a speed of 176 miles per hour and a range of 6 hours. The avionics of the plane, that is, the electronic systems that make it up, were modern. It could fly at night and in bad weather. The pilot had a private pilot's license and had already flown the same route several times, so he was familiar with the surroundings of the mountains and the terrains. However, that was not the plane where Renny usually traveled. He often moved in the plane owned by Gonzalo Fernandez Sin, a member of the MIN and a man close to Renny. But as it was under repair, the offer to fly in Carlos's plane was gladly received by the pre-candidate. After a thorough routine check of the plane's instruments and with beautiful, completely clear weather, the pilot communicates with the control tower to request flight authorization. Olavarria informs the tower that there are 5 people on board, that he has enough fuel for 6 hours, and a climbing capacity of 7,500 feet. Upon receiving authorization from the tower, the plane takes off at 5:13 post-meridiem. The estimated flight duration was 1 hour and 10 minutes, enough time to arrive before dusk. The first few minutes of the flight were normal, no anomalies were reported, but 6 minutes after takeoff, the plane disappeared from the radar. This was one of the last communications from the pilot with the control tower. At this point in the journey, something must have happened inside the plane, which forced them to deviate along a route very close to the mountain range, where they ended up crashing into the mountains. 20 kilometers from Maiquetía, in an inaccessible place due to the dense jungle that covered the surroundings. The rescue efforts have just begun. The Maiquetía airport declared the flight an emergency because it had not reached its destination and its whereabouts were unknown. The technical team was made up of officials from the Ministry of Transport and Communications, the Venezuelan Air Forces, and the National Guard. The rescue team deployed officials and volunteers from the Search and Rescue Brigade and members of the Aeronautical Firefighters and Civil Defense. 25 aircraft, 12 ships, and the recently created Tactical Operational Support Group of the Judicial Police, more remembered as the Gato Group, of whom we will talk more later. The rescue team searched everywhere for remains of the plane, although during the first few days, as it was believed that they had crashed between the mainland of Venezuela and Margarita Island. Officials focused their initial efforts on finding any trace on the unfathomable surface of the sea.
We are precisely where operations are currently being carried out to try to locate the plane where television presenter Reni Ottolina, journalist Ciro Medina, and 3 other people were traveling.
No specific information is yet known about the fate. Raised for Reni Ottolina and the other 4 occupants of the plane missing since yesterday on a trip from Maiquetía to Porlamar.
After long days of searching, the remains of the disaster was spotted on Monday, March 20th. At 3 in the afternoon, a plane from the operation, which was returning, reported having seen some flashes on a hill in the mountain range. He communicated his suspicions to a captain who was piloting a National Guard helicopter, and he immediately proceeded to search the indicated site. One of his crew members, the member of the MIN Political Command, Alfredo Sola, was the first to spot the crashed plane that was carrying Reni and his companions. The charred remains of all of them lay exactly about 8 kilometers south of Tanahuarena, on the plateau of Las Mercedes Hill, between Loma Larga and the stirrup of San Julian, in a place known as the Row of the Indians. That same night, the Civil Aeronautics Directorate issued a statement that was broadcast on all audiovisual media in the country.
The Civil Aeronautics Directorate is pleased to inform that today at 15 hours, the aircraft Sigla YB mill was located. 19P south of Tanagarena at 3,100 feet altitude. By direct observation, it was determined that the aircraft was completely destroyed, and it is estimated that there are no survivors.
The Ministry of Transport and Communications was the body in charge of carrying out the relevant investigations, for which a special commission was established. Official reports concluded that the alleged accident was caused by the pilot's incompetence and the poor weather conditions of the day. In defense of this hypothesis, the specialist maintains, Enrique Martin Cuervo, who participated in the rescue efforts that got in the way of Carlos Olavaria's flight path. A layer of cloud strata that, although they did not make aviation impossible, they did not allow him to have enough visibility. This would explain the reason for the unusual deviation of the plane towards the mountain range, because, assuming this information is true, the pilot, who had plotted a visual flight plan over the sea, probably suffered spatial disorientation when passing through this layer of strata, and thus, inadvertently, and perhaps looking for references to reorient himself, ended up crashing south of Tanahuarena. The main point on which this hypothesis is based is on the alleged incapacities of the pilot. Although Carlos Olavaria had already accumulated several flight hours, according to Enrique Martin, he lacked the necessary training to conduct a flight exclusively under instrumental rules. This means that the pilot was not authorized to handle his plane, depending solely on the sets of mechanisms that composed it. So he was mainly subject to visual contact with the terrain he was flying over, a practice known as visual flight. In relation to the accident hypothesis, it is also pertinent to consider the following data. First, that most accidents in private flights occur when the pilot lacks the necessary qualification. Secondly, that the loss of control is one of the main causes of aviation accidents. And thirdly, it is during the initial ascent where this type of accidents occur the most. The same phase in which the plane was when it began its deviation towards the mountain range. Assuming the basis of the official version's argument as true, all the characteristics of the crash coincide with this field data. However, not in vain, the results of this investigation have been strongly questioned since their publication. It is wrong to consider all suspicion towards the official version as a mere whim of an opposing sector of the time, or a product of the fertile collective imagination. As we will see next, there were several inconsistencies in the government's version which gave rise to very well-founded doubts. The most serious inconsistency between the official version and subsequent investigations is in relation to the state of the weather, a determining factor as it is a flight performed visually. That is, the pilot was obligated to always maintain visual contact with the ground, avoid clouds, and descend if he lost sight of the ground. Through the Miami Hurricane Center, the National Integrity Movement accessed a satellite photograph of the area and the exact time when the flight took place. The American result of the weather condition was contrary to what was recorded in the government reports. The Venezuelan north coast was completely clear. These were the statements of Nedo Panis, who was the coordinator of search and rescue for the Ministry of Transport and Communications.
From the Miami Hurricane Center, at that time, about the weather conditions in the area where Carlos Bolivaria was flying for 5:15 on March 16th, right? It was an absolutely clear day. The thing is that the MTC represents the state and the state's responsibility at a given moment to try to prevent that from becoming known. It has always been like this.
Dissatisfied with the official version, the National Integrity Movement took advantage of the space it gained in Congress to propose initiating a thorough investigation of the case. The proposition of Congressman Perez Hernandez was unanimously approved, and a subcommittee was immediately created within the Interior Political Commission of the Chamber of Deputies to determine the true causes of the alleged accident. The balance of this subcommittee's activity was fruitful. The main officials from the Civil Aviation Directorate and the Department of Air Accidents who participated in the investigations of the Ministry of Transport and Communications were summoned. From these interpellations, enlightening statements were obtained. When questioned about the government report errors, the Director of Civil Aviation found himself cornered, not knowing how to answer certain questions. Excusing his insecurity with the argument that he was not an accident investigator and therefore did not have enough capacity to respond. The problem is that in an unusual way, the director had endorsed with his signature the content of the official reports, which he acknowledged not knowing during his interrogation. Regarding the airplane's fuel, which was suspected to have possibly been contaminated to cause the crash, conflicting statements were received. The Director of Civil Aeronautics answered yes. The fuel had been examined as part of the evaluation of the wreckage, finding as a result that it had not been altered as there was no indication of sabotage. But Dr. Salas Para, who served as head of investigations, responded that the fuel examination could not be carried out because it had evaporated. And according to the search coordinator, Nedo Panis, none of the documents provided contained evidence of a possible examination of the oil or hydraulic fluids. Nor do they appear the laboratory that could have done this study. Finally, when Dr. Salaspara was asked if he thought it was possible that the plane's fuel had been contaminated, the head of investigations replied, "Everything is possible." The list of errors and arbitrariness during the development of the official investigation continued to extend over time. In relation to the interpellations to Congress, Nedo Panis denounced that the government issued its conclusive report on the causes of the alleged accident hastily and avoiding several professional criteria. According to his testimony in his capacity as a collaborator of the Ministry of Transport and Communications, he received it on April 20th of the year 78. A list of 14 fundamental tasks that were still to be completed in the investigations. But in less than 3 weeks, the government published the first report of all, where the supposed definitive reasons for the alleged accident were explained. This was insufficient time to complete the not small list of essential tasks, which included radar check flights, a check flight of probable maneuvers that the plane could have made after takeoff, determine turning ready at the crash site, make topographic models at different scales of the area, etc. If there was so much work left to do, it is legitimate to ask what this first conclusive government report was based on to determine with certainty the causes of the crash. The government was also blamed for publishing simplistic and incomplete reports for other reasons. In an interview, Nedo Panis explained that the bodies were not autopsied as protocol dictates, they were only identified and the belongings of the deceased were established. It was also not determined whether the plane's controls, the ailerons, the rudder and the depth rudder were functioning at the time of impact. And finally, the remains of the crash were not properly preserved. Meanwhile, the elements were removed without leaving a record of it in aerography. But of all the arbitrariness, none is as remembered as the strange performance of the Gatto group. When the remains of the plane were located, several officials from the Gatto group of the police, judicial technician went to the place along with a team of rescue specialists. Due to the dense vegetation of the area, they were forced to descend by tactics to carry out their duties. They had been entrusted to protect the remains of the aircraft, take care of the belongings left by the deceased, and prevent any theft, subtraction, alteration, or modification of the remains. However, they were unsatisfied with their tasks without any clear explanation. The officials fired their new 1074 rifles at the plane, damaging parts of the event's components. Although these shots were fired long after the crash and it was explained that they were actually practicing target shooting, the damage they caused, whether intentional or not, generated great suspicion among the public. As they had been professionally trained for special tasks related to the kidnapping of people and aircraft, the Gatto group was supposed to be thorough in carrying out their operations. And due to the secret nature of the body and its use for corruption during that time, special attention has been given to their involvement in the investigations into the death of Reni Ottolina. It has even been suggested, though without any proof, that they were sent to finish off any possible survivors of the Estrello. The truth is that their officials, with or without premeditation, made the expertise difficult, and the body was dissolved shortly after. For his involvement in major scandals like the murder of the lawyer Carmona. Now, in relation to the government of Carlos Andres Perez and the crashed plane, there is a fact unknown to the public to this day, which transcends in importance the controversy of the Gatto group. As we explained before, Carlos Olavarria resorted to a financial society of the provincial bank to finance the acquisition of the Cessna 310, so that plane was in the name of Final BEM. This company used to secure its credits with insurance companies, and in this case it did so through Lloyd's, an insurance market in Great Britain, for the amount of approximately $350,000. Upon learning of the disaster, the British sent a group of experts to assess whether they should pay the insurance. However, after an analysis of the instruments, they refused to pay the policy, which put Final BEM in a complicated situation. According to the testimony provided to us by Eduardo Mesas Rojas, who worked as an assistant to the board of directors of the society, and handled the legal and logistical aspect of the purchase of the airplane. The financial institution managed to solve the problem thanks to the government, as they offered to pay the amount of the policy in exchange for avoiding further investigations. As informed by the then representative of Finalbem, the businessman Arturo Sosa Fernandez, in summary, Eduardo Mesa's testimony suggests an alleged intention of the government to avoid more scandals, in a case that was already costing him many accusations in the media. Due to the inconsistencies we have narrated and how untimely Renny's death was for national politics, In the collective imagination, the hypothesis that his death was orchestrated by the spheres of power has prevailed. Those who on more than one occasion conspired to silence his critical voice and wished for him to retire from politics, as we explained in our documentary about his life. Unhappy with the results of the government reports, the secretary of the National Integrity Movement Party, Gonzalo Perez Hernandez, maintained that the aircraft had been tampered with.
At a certain altitude, it was programmed to trigger a device and start to enter the interior of the plane. The lethal gas due to the wind that was received through the duct where it was placed. That must have produced in them a total numbness, a lethal numbness, death.
Perez Hernandez, who participated in the congressional interrogations and knew the case thoroughly, based his complaint on an interview he had with a famous Venezuelan scientist. According to his testimony, this scientist informed him that 15 days before the disaster, a German expert in lethal gas sabotage was brought in from abroad. The expert apparently introduced, through the air intake of the plane, an instrument that consisted of a container that contained lethal gases and an altimeter with the ability to trigger the emission of gas into the interior of the plane. However, this is a weak hypothesis that is difficult to corroborate. On the one hand, the plane was not pressurized, so it would have had to undergo significant modifications to the ventilation system. And if an instrument like the one described by Perez Hernandez had been installed, it probably would have been seen by the pilot during the routine check or by his crew. On the other hand, according to Enrique Martin Cuervo, the PTJ officials and the forensic experts who arrived at the scene did not report finding traces of explosives or toxic gas residues impregnated in the bodies. Apart from the hypothesis held by the National Integrity Movement, there were others that circulated in the streets more as public conjectures. The most popular of them suggests that the real target of the alleged sabotage was not Reni Ottolina but Jorge Olavarria, the famous journalist, cousin of the pilot who wanted to leave the country to escape the arrest warrant that had been unjustly issued against him for the crime of defamation. The persecution of Jorge Olavarria by armed men and his escape from the judicial system. It happened exactly the same day that Renny would travel to Porlamar in Carlos Olavarria's plane, that is, on March 16th. Starting from this coincidence, it is speculated that Jorge Olavarria's enemies within the government sabotaged his cousin's plane, anticipating that he would escape the country through that means. However, like the MIM hypothesis, this version has also not been proven. As we reviewed earlier, the officials responsible for the investigations clung to the pilot's experience to explain the main cause of the crash of the small plane. But if the weather report they provided did not match the one issued by the Miami office, could it be true that Carlos Olavarria was ignorant of the basic operation of his own plane's instruments? The American expert James Serra, hired by the MIM with authorization from the Civil Aviation Directorate, noted in his analysis that the pilot was indeed competent in the type of aircraft he was flying. There are 3 direct sources that attest to this information. The first of them is the testimony of Jorge Olavarria, the pilot's cousin, whom we have already discussed. Regarding the reports, he stated that Carlos had passed his pilot's course in an entirely satisfactory manner, and that there was no precedent in his life that indicated that he was an irresponsible or careless person, as he had never had a single accident, not even a car accident, and he was an extremely meticulous and careful pilot. The second source comes from the former assistant to the board of directors of Finalbem, the financial company that Carlos turned to for the acquisition of his plane. according to Mr. Eduardo Mesa Rojas, who also personally knew Carlos and was involved in the purchase. The pilot had to undergo training in the United States where he learned to fly the plane he wanted to acquire. And after successfully passing the tests, he flew that same plane from Florida to Caracas, accompanied by a pilot and a mechanic from the Cessna company. These workers stayed in the capital until the plane met all the requirements demanded by the Venezuelan authorities. So in terms of permits, everything was in order. And finally, according to Nedo Panis, the analysis of the pilot's flight log. He stated that he already had at least 10 hours of instrument flight training and night flight. Therefore, even though it wasn't enough time to obtain an instrument flight certification, it contradicts the idea that he completely lacked experience in handling these rules, as he was already, albeit minimally, familiarized. Due to the enormous stir caused by Renny's death and the proximity of the next presidential elections, this case had a strong impact on national politics. Taking advantage of these circumstances, the opposition candidate Luis Herrera Campins promised that, if elected, he would bring a group of experts to the country to unravel the truth about the accident. According to Gonzalo Perez Hernandez, the government of Carlos Andres Perez, fearing that the Copilano candidate would fulfill his promise, hired James Serra, the same American expert who had previously been hired by the MIM, having first concluded that the pilot was indeed competent in handling the plane. The expert contradicted his previous results, declaring on television that the plane crash occurred due to the pilot's disorientation and the weather conditions. According to Alfredo Anzola, who was an important member of the MIM, the expert's statements were dishonest.
That gentleman here in Venezuela, they pressured him to change the tone of his report a bit, and who pressured him? The government?
The accident was not investigated, and whatever was done backwards.
It was done so poorly, and it makes me suspect that there was something other than an accident. Was there any interest then?
Obviously, I think there was an interest in covering something up. Who would benefit from assassinating Tolima's king?
Look, anyone who saw their privileges in danger. Remember that Venezuela was and still is a great society of accomplices, where the most privileged protect each other.
Statements that contradict each other, an official investigation denounced as incomplete, clear indications of arbitrariness that cast doubt on the government, and several uncorroborated unofficial hypotheses. These are the pieces that make up the intricate puzzle of Renny's mysterious death. There are numerous arguments that can be made for or against both versions, and with this special delivery, we trust we have clarified some doubts about it, just as we acknowledge the complexity of a case that, by its nature, does not offer categorical answers. It will probably persist for a long time or maybe forever. The mystery about the real causes of the death of Reni Ottolina, the #1 of Venezuelan television and the candidate for the presidency of the country. And you? What do you think? Was it an accident or an attack? Leave your opinion in the comment box.
So you've changed your mind? How do you feel about having another child? What's going on?
Look, I don't know, but however, I have a different position, much less emphatic, much less emotional, much less angry. My father left, and without a doubt, he left because it was his time to go.
Despite that change in position regarding your father's death, do you still believe he was murdered?
There's doubt, but just as I tell you, there's doubt that he was murdered. There's doubt that maybe he wasn't murdered. If it was in someone's hands, then it was. If it was in the hands of fate, it had to be.
Thank you very much for watching the video until the end. We look forward to your opinions in the comment box. Remember to subscribe to the channel and follow us on Instagram. If you haven't done so, we'll see you next time. Goodbye.